Welcome to session 13. In this session, we will finish up developing our base pay program. That's the cake. And then we'll turn our attention to icing the cake. In my mind, that's an appropriate analogy. The base pay program is the base we build on. It provides the structure for the good stuff, the icing. Now, I know some of you say that the cake is better than the icing, and I never really understood that. The icing is clearly the best part. That said, just eating a can of icing also leaves something to be desired. It's incomplete. It really takes the cake to make the icing taste better, to make it special. That's kind of the way it is with compensation. The incentives taste better with a base that we can depend on, and we tend to take that base for granted. The cake provides the base for the good stuff. Without the base, the icing or the incentives taste very different. To put it another way, the incentives mean more once we have our basic needs, think of Maslow, taken care of. Our base pay program is designed to last a long time and provide structure for paying people. That's what it does. It pays people. It provides a mechanism to split the compensation funds among employees. Now that doesn't motivate people, and we only hope that it doesn't demotivate people either. So if our goal is to merely pay people and spend money, we're finished. We need to go no further. But if we want to invest money into improved performance and higher returns for the organization, we need to add some incentives. Incentives are the difference, in my opinion, between an expense and an investment in the terms of compensation. Now, while the base is intended to provide structure and last for a long time, incentives should be reviewed and changed regularly. When I hear companies talk about their incentive program that has been in place for several years, I tend to believe that it is now a part of the structure and essentially expected by employees. When incentives become expected, they lose a lot of their motivating and incentive characteristics. You know, I worked in an organization that paid a year-end incentive to employees sometime in November based on overall company performance. I don't really believe that's a good incentive program to begin with, but they thought so at some point. They had paid that bonus for years and proudly bragged about it as a great incentive to employees. At one point, the economy tanked and the company was losing money. A year-end bonus was not reasonable. Company performance was terrible, and the numbers normally used to compute the bonus said 0. And employees knew those numbers as well. Their reaction was terrible. Employees felt that the company was taking away the Christmas bonus. It wasn't an incentive, it was expected in good and bad times. It's an example of an incentive program that really isn't an incentive. An example of an incentive program that has gone stale. Incidentally, we decided to pay that bonus, although less than the previous years, and we stopped calling it an incentive bonus and started calling it a Christmas bonus, which is really what it was. It was time to start looking for another way to incentivize our employees, and we should have done that quite earlier than that. Just like everything else we've talked about, incentives work if they are developed and structured properly. This session explores that development and that structure. Let's take a look at finishing our base pay program and establishing incentives. Welcome to session 13. Let's do a bit of a recap. Remember our 7 steps for establishing a base pay program? Here's the website and the 7 steps. And keep in mind that we are developing a base pay program. We haven't discussed, other than briefly, all of the fancy stuff that can go on top, such as incentive pay. Last session covered step 5, but I must admit, I spilled over substantially into step 6. If performance management is an integral part of tying pay to performance, we can't really separate the two components completely. And step 6 is all about administering a merit increase plan, which by definition is about performance. Now that we have established that circular relationship, and I have justified my coloring out of the lines last week, let's continue our discussion by tying pay directly to performance. Step 6 from the website states, and I quote, "The sixth step is linking pay for performance. This includes designing the process of determining merit increases based on a distribution of individual performance ratings. This can be accomplished by designing a merit increase matrix. A merit increase matrix is a process for giving managers a uniform tool to determine the size of the merit increase for each employee. This matrix is based on performance rating distribution in relation to the employee's salary position in their salary range or salary index. In developing this matrix, it is important to determine where the organization pays in relation to the market. A company with high turnover will have many employees near the lower ends of the salary ranges. A company that pays far below the market may need a higher than normal merit matrix to increase pay to the appropriate levels. Top performers should receive merit increases that are significantly higher than employees who are meeting expectations if possible. These increases should be double the size of increases received by employees who meet expectations. Employees who are significantly below performance expectations generally do not receive increases." I don't particularly agree that top performers should receive double the increase of average employees, but they should certainly be higher. And note that I have added the highlights to this quote to help you focus on the important aspects of this step. Now, the website defines a merit increase matrix, but what does a merit increase matrix really look like in the real world? The following website is a great summary of how to develop such a matrix and what the finished product looks like. Of course, there are merit matrices that are more complex, but there really aren't very many that are any simpler than the first matrix depicted in this website. The second and third matrices are more appropriate in that they allow departmental managers to have some discretion in the amount they give to employees. Regardless, the merit matrix represents guidelines for managers to grant increases within the budgetary bounds of the current year. Since these are guidelines, one shouldn't be lulled into complacency and allow guidelines to do all of the work, make all of the decisions, and solve all the issues. It is permissible to go outside the guidelines by granting more or less of an increase than suggested, but such deviations normally require special approval and thus some justification. The bulk of pay adjustments should fall within the guidelines. The second website gives a very brief but informative description of how to develop a merit increase matrix. It also brings into play the use of compa ratio, remember that from the last session, as a mechanism to help determine the amount of the increase a person should receive. This is the Dresser Associates website. Taking this website and the previous reference, I think you get the idea of what a matrix looks like. You understand its purpose and generally how to develop one. Now, in the interest of fair play, I should also point out that there is controversy related to merit matrices as well. Most of the controversy emanates from the issue of how do we tie pay to performance. And here are a few examples. The first website is highly critical of traditional pay for performance programs, and particularly the matrix guidelines. Although the author is in favor of pay for performance, he brings some criticisms, and some very valid, of this type of system. I'm troubled that he seems to offer little in solutions, though. He is of the opinion that the matrix must be followed without exception, and that leads to stars getting shortchanged and in danger of leaving. The author bemoans the fact that there is market competition that creates budgets that restrict the amount of money flowing into the compensation program and thus endangers the stars. Well, There is market competition always, and therefore budgets are necessary. And as we discussed earlier, compensation must compete for that portion of the pie. My solution is that the guidelines aren't etched in stone and should always be open to exceptions. The fact that it takes special approval for exceptions is a good problem. The second website also is in favor of pay for performance, but argues against the matrix as a way of distributing budgeted funds. The article does suggest a different approach, but seems very concerned about defining high-risk employees, top performers who are at risk of leaving, and then doing something special for those employees. In other words, keeping the superstars. The author states, and I quote, "Is this any way to run a successful business in 2014? Not really. Talent experts have been telling us for years to identify top performers, incent them like crazy, and watch them every second so competitors won't steal them away. In short, treat them better than you treat everyone else, not the same way." End quote. Actually, I think it's a good way to run a business in 2014, or now for that matter. Again, the solution is not to let the guidelines rule your existence. Feel free to make exceptions, but make them consciously, openly, and with the scrutiny of others. In other words, justify the exceptions and then make them. Once again, it sounds like the authors of these two websites and articles are just upset with the faulty performance management system. I believe there is certainly a place for the merit matrix, but we probably want to enhance our pay program to make it more effective. The merit matrix can form the base. After all, we are developing a base pay program. We can do additional things to incentivize and reward our stars, to borrow a phrase from the first website. In these two articles, it doesn't appear that the merit matrix is the problem, but the problem really involves a lack of support programs surrounding it. And that is our next topic. So there we have it. We have developed a base pay program. We did a job analysis and defined what our people are doing in each job, and then did a job evaluation and placed a value on each job. Once we had a handle on what things look like internally, we did a market analysis to determine how we stack up against the outside world. And with that data in hand, we developed our structures and pay grades and finished it off by developing a merit increase matrix to provide structure and guidelines to our managers to distribute our compensation funds to employees. Now all we have to do is maintain this system and continuously monitor the program. We are indeed equipped to pay our employees in a systematic, predictable, and fair way. Okay, fair may have went a little too far, but at least fair in our eyes. So does our creation now motivate our people? Does this pay program change our expenditure from an expense into an investment? Well, you know, it really wasn't set up to motivate people. It was set up to pay people, pay them fairly, and not to demotivate people. I mentioned in an earlier session that the base pay program is something we can build upon. It's time to start our building project. What kind of amenities can we add that will make our money expenditure more effective? We can turn to incentives or variable pay to further reward our valued high-performing employees. This is one of the more interesting and exciting parts of compensation. Now, I know what you're thinking. This guy really has to get a life if he thinks this is interesting and exciting. It's interesting, okay, maybe not exciting, but it is interesting because you can be creative with incentives, and there are countless combinations. Also, I believe to be effective, incentives can't be stagnant. They have to change over time. I guess I find it exciting because I've seen properly developed incentives propel disinterested employees to be engaged and involved. Now, there is a distinction between incentive pay and incentives. Incentive pay is compensation that is tied to performance, as we have been discussing. Incentives are tangible rewards that encourage or motivate action and includes things other than pay. You also hear the term variable pay, and I generally use that interchangeably with incentive pay. Now, there are thousands, I don't know, maybe millions of different incentive plans. They are all different because they, almost by definition, must be tailored to each business, and some businesses have multiple incentive plans. I wish we had time to go over many of them, but that would be impossible. Therefore, my goal will be to give you a flavor of incentive programs, both simple and complex, and also to give you some key principles and guidelines for developing incentives. And we think of incentive plans in monetary terms, but some of the best programs do not involve hard cash. I'll give you some examples of those as well. But as has been my practice, let me put incentives into a home perspective. Let me start by asking a simple but critical question. Do incentives work? Well, just like all other programs we have discussed, to have a chance of working, they must be developed properly. And if developed properly, of course they work. Incentives surround us. They are everywhere. Incentives attack you and your motivation and behavior multiple times each day. You use incentives in your home. Come to think of it, you use incentives on yourself. How many times have you said to yourself, if I lose weight or get an A in this class or learn this skill, I'll treat myself to fill in the blank? You have just set up an incentive program. If you have kids, do you use incentives on them? I bet you do. And we won't even go into the incentives between spouses. My goodness, we'd be here all day. How about others using incentives on you? Every day I receive some incentive offer to go to this sale or sign up for this website or receive something in return. In other words, they are trying to incentivize me to behave in a particular manner. And isn't that what incentives are? You see, incentives work for ourselves, they work on our children, they work on our spouses, and they work in the marketplace. Of course, they would work in the workplace. I'm just surprised at the number of organizations that merely pay people and actually don't offer any incentives. Here's an interesting quote. Research in many organizations shows well-designed incentives return about 4 times what the organization invests in incentive awards paid. That's from the book High Performance Pay. Now think about what this quote is saying for a minute. What does it really say? It says that properly designed incentives pay for themselves. They do not cost the organization anything. Oh wait, that's wrong. They don't pay for themselves, they actually bring additional money in. They actually do more than pay for themselves. That's amazing. Not using incentives is like finding a $100 bill laying on the sidewalk and not picking it up. Why wouldn't we pick it up? Well, we tell ourselves it may be a fake $100 bill, or it may take too much effort to pick it up, or it may not work like other $100 bills. I can't explain why an organization wouldn't aggressively explore incentives, but there are many such companies out there. So if we want to pick that $100 bill up, how do we start? How do we set up an incentive program? The book that I referenced earlier, High Performance Pay, highlights 7 principles of incentive design. The 7 principles are: know why incentives will help. It's one thing to know that incentives overall work just about everywhere. It's quite another thing to know why they work. Why they work is very specific to the organization and the situation. The book referenced earlier states, quote, the only reasons to use incentives are to help improve performance and add value to the business, end quote. In terms of determining the business situation, are the reasons for proposing incentives poor business performance or marginally acceptable performance or acceptable performance? The first reason and its connection to incentives is obvious. But the second and third reasons, marginally acceptable and acceptable performance, requires a little exploration. Do we really want merely acceptable performance? Why settle for acceptable when we can get outstanding performance? The goal of any business should be to drive beyond acceptable. Even if a business performance is exceptional, incentives may offer an avenue of greater business opportunity. The need to improve and the opportunity to improve provides the business case or the justification to explore incentives. Number two, choose the right performance measures. Obviously, the measures used are critical to the design and success of any incentive program. The measures selected should depend on what is most important and what can be influenced by employees. You see, employees rarely have control over an outcome, but can certainly influence outcomes. Ask yourself when designing an incentive program, can employees influence the desired outcome? And the book states that a workable, understandable, and accepted incentive plan usually has no more than 3 to 5 performance measures. Beyond that, it gets too complex. The measures must be important, and the employees must be able to influence the desired outcome. The next step is choose the right incentive design. As I stated before, there are many incentive designs, too many to go into much detail here. However, the design must fit the business and the culture of the organization. The following website identifies some issues related to incentive design, but also offers some excellent questions to ask when choosing a design. The article really hits the nail on the head of the problem of implementing incentives in a haphazard way and choosing an incentive design carelessly. The next step, put the right amount of stretch in goals and measures. How does the organization define excellent, satisfactory, and unsatisfactory performance? What does good look like? Now, haven't I worn that phrase out enough here? What should leadership demand in terms of performance before the goal is reached and the incentive is paid? Make sure the design provides enough stretch in the goals. Let me illustrate with an example. At the Noel Group, we were designing an incentive program that included goals related to work safety. The organization had experienced a few lost time accidents and several incidents and near misses. Our goal was obviously no lost time accidents. That's a no-brainer. But how many incidents or near misses were acceptable? Management was trying to determine an acceptable level when the president of the company flatly stated that no incidents or near misses is the only thing that's acceptable. Managers argued that 0 was not realistic. It was not possible. There would always be incidents and near misses. The president was adamant. 0 was the goal. It may not be obtainable every quarter of the year, particularly in the near term, but eventually it could and would be consistently achieved. He mandated 0, and managers accepted. There were certainly quarters with some incidents and near misses, and in those quarters there was no incentive paid. However, within a short time, employees understood that good looked like no incidents and near misses. It was within their control, and they made it happen. Within the year, we were having consistent quarters with no incidents or near misses. This certainly was a stretch goal, but it was one that was achievable. Because of this goal and great leadership, employees were safer, had more money in their pocket, and the company saved significant money through safe work practices. If you can make a C in this class, a stretch goal is an A. What are your stretch goals? Step number 5. Measure performance where it counts the most. Communication and education are critical in helping employees understand what is important. Also in understanding why it is important and how they can influence the outcome. Measure what is important to the organization and make it important to the employees. Number 6. Evaluate outcomes and change as needed. If incentives work as designed, then performance in a particular area should improve. At what point do we stop providing incentives for particular behavior that we have already achieved and switch to incentivizing another desired outcome? Incentives must change as performance improves and business conditions change. If incentives remain in place too long, improvement stops and the motivation grows stale. Simply put, we begin wasting our money. When do we change our incentives? There's no easy or universal answer. We change when we need to change, but first, we must understand that ultimately change is certainly needed at some point. Number 7, communicate, champion, and don't give up. Do I really need to go into detail here? Communicate, communicate, communicate. It's essential, as I've stated previously, to the success of any program, and incentive design is no exception. If you follow these principles, you probably will add significant value to your organization. Whenever an incentive plan fails, the failure is commonly attributable to missing one or more of these key design principles. Let me give you a few examples of incentive programs that work from my experience and from other organizations. I'll represent designs from the simple and inexpensive to the more complex. Let's start with the simple and non-monetary. When I worked at Crown Wood Products, I decided that our supervisors needed a simple reward that they could give employees on the spot for positive behaviors and actions. It couldn't cost much, but it had to have a visible impact. In other words, it had to be recognizable. At that facility, we had a cafeteria. Employees either brought their lunch from home or ate at the cafeteria. I created a certificate that said, quote, I really appreciate your help with fill in the blank. Please accept a free lunch on me as thanks for your concern and support, end quote. The supervisor would fill in the blank with the good deed and hand it to the employee. The certificate was small enough to allow supervisors to carry around several in their pockets and enable them to present it to employees on the spot. The certificates were printed on bright pink paper so to be easily recognized by all employees. It's called a spot award. The goal was simple. Supervisors could present something of value to employees in appreciation of some behavior or action. For example, unforeseen production needs require someone to work overtime on very short notice. The supervisor asks someone to step up and fill the requirement. An employee volunteers immediately, thereby solving a potentially difficult problem. The supervisor presents the certificate to the employee. The employee feels good, and everyone can see the award, thus reinforcing positive behavior in the organization. It's as simple as action, appreciation, reward. Immediately upon proposing this program, management and specifically financial management introduced concern that the program would be abused. Objections included supervisors would use the certificates for their own lunch. Supervisors would give them only to their friends. Supervisors would hand them out for meaningless tasks. Complaints of favoritism would be rampant, and on and on and on. The solutions included number the certificates sequentially and track them by supervisor. Make supervisors sign for the certificates and submit a report as to who they were given to and why. Establish a list of behaviors worthy of a certificate and ensure that supervisors only gave the certificates for those behaviors. Charge the cost of each certificate back to the department, and on and on and on. As you can see, simple turned into a paperwork nightmare. With all of these restrictions and justifications, supervisors would never give out a certificate. It just wasn't worth it. Well, I rejected all of these solutions and merely stated that I trust our supervisors to be honest and professional. Positive behaviors vary from situation to situation and should be defined by the supervisor, not someone else. If we can't trust our leaders, the problem is much deeper than merely a certificate. I met with supervisors and explained the program. Each supervisor was given 10 certificates. They were to use them as a tool to thank and motivate employees. They should use them as they need by their own definition. If there were reports of favoritism, they would have to deal with it. They could give their certificates out to individuals, groups, or to their whole team. They did not have to track anything. I didn't need to know what they did with them. They only needed to justify the use to themselves and to their employees. They didn't have to use them at all if they so chose. Their certificates were merely a tool at their disposal. If they used the first 10 certificates, they could come back to me and ask for more and receive as many as they wanted. Supervisors were amazed at the lack of control and the amount of trust that we placed in them, and they used their certificates freely and often. It was a great program. No abuse or favoritism was ever apparent. What's really interesting is that the program was inexpensive. Most employees really didn't like eating in the cafeteria anyway, so often their certificates would go unredeemed. But that didn't reduce the tangible value of the certificate. It was a statement of appreciation and good deeds, not a free meal. Also, that one program reinforced our culture and sent messages to supervisors and employees alike. It also sent a message to management that we should trust our people rather than trying to constantly control them. You see, simple is good. A monetary-based program that I'm very fond of is called gain sharing. Simply put, gain sharing is about measuring the gains in an organization and sharing those gains with employees. The following 3 websites give a definition and explanation of gain sharing and provide some examples. The first website gives a lot of detail on gain sharing in a very short, concise article. It includes a reference at the bottom to an article by Robert L. Masternack. This is also an excellent article, although long, that explains profit sharing and gain sharing. Take the time to read through it and find out how profit sharing and gain sharing works in an easy to understand story. I've provided both links below. The third website provides a link to Wikipedia and their explanation on gain sharing. It's also worth reading. An organization that has used gain sharing and incentives extensively and actually made them a part of their culture is Nucor Steel. They represent a real success story in the use of incentives to drive their business towards success. The following link gives some information on Nucor. Pay particular attention to the sections on decentralized management philosophy and performance-based compensation. The Nucor Steel story is well known, and there's a lot of information on the company and the incentive pay plans that they have implemented. Feel free to explore the company more on the internet. I believe you'll find it very interesting in a lot of different ways. So we know that incentives work, and we now have an idea of some of the considerations we should address when designing incentive programs. Obviously, nothing is all good in this world, so there are advantages and disadvantages to incentive programs as well. The following 2 websites identify at least some of the advantages and disadvantages for you to ponder. Once you click on the first website, you will see an advertisement, and you will have to click on Continuing to Cite in the upper right-hand corner to actually get to the website. The article itself is entitled Creating Incentive Plans That Actually Incent Employees. The second website addresses the advantages of team-based incentives, but it also points out that incentives don't have to be, and frequently are not, individually based. Given the advantages and disadvantages, how prolific is the use of incentives in the marketplace? This last website identifies some statistics surrounding incentive usage. The site also gives some good definitions of various incentive types, such as spot awards, the Crown Wood Products example I gave above, retention bonuses, project bonuses, etc. The data demonstrates that a large number of employers use incentives, and more than 75% of those use at least 2 incentive programs. Incentives are big and becoming bigger each year. I hope the coverage of this topic has whet your appetite for the power of incentives. You can do some research on your own, in that there is no shortage of data on incentive programs anywhere. Incentives offer a solution to how to marry pay for performance to the base pay plan. Since when properly designed, incentives are self-funding, they offer a way to pay employees more even in times of restricted budgets and restricted compensation expenditures. The use of incentives and incentive pay is restricted only by the limits of your imagination. I'm often confronted with new, innovative incentive programs that amaze me. I get that feeling, and you've probably had it in other situations. Now, why didn't I think of that? Incentives are here to stay and provide opportunity for success for employees and employers. When done properly, incentives offer, I believe, a win-win scenario. And you know what? You don't often find that in business. Actually, you don't often find that in life. Next, we will explore an area of incentive pay that is extremely controversial. Executive pay has been criticized, and with good reason, in recent years. We will explore those criticisms and the nature of executive pay. We will then delve into benefits to understand how they contribute to the competitive formula.